Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Allison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Dr. Victoria Wolcott, Professor of History and Director of the Gender Institute at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Wolcott is currently working on The Embodied Resistance of Rosina Robinson, Athleticism and Activism in the Cold War Era, a biography of Rosina Robinson. Now, I'm always intrigued when someone wants to talk about a woman that even I haven't heard of. So, can you introduce us to her and her work?
People in the audience will not have heard of her. She is not, somebody who is a prominent figure, even during the period that she was alive, but she's really intriguing and surmounted amazing obstacles and put up really remarkable resistance during the Cold War. So I really wanted to write about her. She grew up in Chicago. She's an African American woman, and she grew up in Chicago in a middle class family. Her and her sisters were very, very good track and field athletes in the period that she was growing up. One of her sisters actually made it to the Olympics, which is very remarkable in the late 1950s. She went on to join a radical pacifist group in the 40s, in the late 1940s, called the Peacemakers, which I'm happy to speak more about. And she really kind of combined her track and field athleticism on the field with her activism as well. So she was a civil rights activist as well as a radical pacifist against the militarism of the Cold War era. She carried out a number of demonstrations during her lifetime, a number of which ended up with her imprisoned. And when she was in prison, she actually carried out hunger strikes, which is something that other radical pacifists in the period did. So I was really interested in how she used her body both on the field as an athlete, but also using her body in terms of resistance in these hunger strikes and in these demonstrations. So this is in the 50s and the 1960s, sort of the height of the conformity of the Cold War.
So, with the hunger strikes, I feel like when we talk about women activists and hunger strikes, at least what I think of is typically suffragettes in Britain in particular,
Right.
who were doing this. But obviously, they aren't the only ones. And I don't think they even originated this tactic. What is it about hunger strikes that makes them effective or not? I don't actually know if they are particularly an effective form of activism.
Actually, sociologists who've really looked closely at this point out that hunger strikes actually can be quite effective in terms of particularly group hunger strikes, that there is actually a record of effectiveness. And you're absolutely right to point to the suffragists. There were earlier versions of hunger strikes, political hunger strikes in Russia and in Ireland. There are some older traditions of hunger striking for political purposes, but it was the suffragists who took this to its sort of end in terms of political activism, and they're the ones who really developed the idea of using this as a tactic in the UK, and then that gets transported to the United States. So Alice Paul, who was one of the more radical suffragists in the United States, goes to England in the early 20th century and learns about the hunger strike from the suffragists who were imprisoned in England, joins them in a number of actions in England, actually, in their hunger strikes to gain suffrage, and then brings that tactic back to the United States. And so in the late 19 teens, leading up to suffrage in the US, you have a number of instances of suffragists led by Alice Paul who were imprisoned and who demanded to be treated as political prisoners, which is the kind of status a male prisoner would often have in a political situation, and went on hunger strikes until those demands were met or until they were released. So it really does originate as a political tactic out of the suffrage movement. And one of the figures which it influenced was Mahatma Gandhi. So Gandhi was actually in London during some of the early hunger strikes. So the suffragists knew about the movement, knew about the tactic, and he, of course, incorporates the hunger strike and fasting in general into his own political practices in India. And so that's also the kind of conduit to the United States. So the pacifists that I study are both getting this from the longer history of suffrage, but also from Gandhi and the sort of radical pacifist movement using these Gandhian tactics of nonviolence. And then they deploy it in particular during the Cold War to protest the sort of militarism, the arms race, et cetera, during that period. So there is this direct connection.
Something that's intriguing about it when we're talking about particularly, I'm going to say middle class white women,
Hmm.
is that the state response, so the prison officials, then implemented these really brutal tactics of force feeding.
That's right.
And I'm sure we could make all sorts of comments about, women's bodily autonomy. I don't know. I assume that they did the same thing to men when men employed these tactics at different stages. But my understanding is that there was something particularly impactful about these women's stories when they were able to tell them, in that, this is what men did to women, and this is
Yeah.
the brutality of it.
And you're absolutely right to point out both the class and racial status of the suffragists, because this is really important, right? So, and again, this really originates in the UK and then gets transported to the United States. But their respectability, their class status, and their racial status really help to lead to a kind of sensationalization of force feeding, which suffragists routinely equated with rape and with sexual assault, that they were being violated, that they were being penetrated as these, tubes and other instruments are put down their throats. And the force feeding stories are absolutely horrific, but they're also talking about this as a way to get the public to pay attention to their plight because of their, their respectable middle class women. And that's true in the United States as well. Alice Paul, who led the National Women's Party, was a white woman who had a very kind of fraught relationship with African American women who were involved in the suffrage movement. And so most of the suffragists in the United States who were arrested and went on these hunger strikes were themselves white and also deployed these kinds of ideals of respectability. So they had these tours that they would do in the US of the hunger strikers after they'd been released from prison, where they'd go in front of large audiences or large rallies and talk about the experience of being force fed, about the brutality of the prison experience as a way to gain public support and public recognition for their larger cause. So there is that kind of respectability and a sort of racial aspect that is definitely going through the suffragist story and in terms of the hunger strike.
Now let's tie that back to, as her friends called her, Rose.
Yes.
As an African American woman, she would not have had access to the same levels of sympathy on a public
Hmm.
front. There is significantly less sympathy for women of color, particularly African American women, compared to white women, both then and certainly still today.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So both her, there's actually a friend of hers, a fellow activist, Juanita Nelson, also a Black woman who was arrested a number of times and went on hunger strikes as well. You see the public reaction to them in terms of particularly the mainstream press being much more lukewarm than some of the white female pacifists who are also arrested. The one that has a little bit of a name recognition would be Marjorie Swan. She was a white mother, and she gets a lot of attention when she's arrested because, again, she's wearing pearls and she's kind of this white middle class woman whose politics were very radical, but she, again, garnered that kind of public support. Within the movement, I mean, the radical pacifists who were involved in the peacemaker movement, which is the primary organization that Rose Robinson is involved in, they really believed in a kind of full or utopian almost interracialism. So she got a lot of support and a lot of solidarity within the movement, which I think is really sort of interesting, not necessarily something that would be taken for granted. But I think also in terms of the fact that her and Juanita Nelson were women, what they had experienced is that during World War II, conscientious objectors who refused to fight during the war, who were all male, they were imprisoned during World War II, often for long stretches. So the most famous would be Bayard Rustin, who is a famous African American civil rights activist. And those men deployed hunger strikes and what we call total non-cooperation, which meant they refused to do anything they were told to do. So they wouldn't eat, but they also refused to like walk into the courtroom or follow any kinds of instructions. It's a very kind of extreme form of resistance. So there was a relatively small group of about 30 or so of these men imprisoned during World War II, radical pacifists who did that total non-cooperation. So what Juanita and Rose were the first women who took that, and then when they were arrested in the 50s and then into the early 60s, they also practiced total non-cooperation. So they were also fighting against militarism and fighting against the war machine as women in ways that were really interesting and innovative for the period.
It is just making me contemplate as well the fact that the more marginalized you are, the greater the risks you take when doing the same activism, when you take the same actions. Juanita and Rose were at much greater risk in different ways compared to, the mother with the pearls.
Yeah, absolutely. They were definitely at greater risk. One of her longest imprisonment, Rose Robinson, was arrested in early 1960 because she had been refusing to pay her taxes for more than a decade, which is part of the activism that these people were engaged in. They refused to pay taxes because they did not want to support, again, militarism and state violence, essentially. So because of that, eventually the IRS catches up with her, even though legally she was below the poverty rate, so she didn't really need to pay taxes, but this was, harassment by the state. And she was dragged in front of the judge. She refused to walk. She was dragged in front of the judge. And he basically sentenced her to a year in jail, not for the tax refusal, but because she refused to cooperate. Basically for being, rebellious, to sentence her for a year in jail. She was actually ended up being released after 6 months, in part because of the hunger strike. They were force feeding her twice a day. And that was garnering a fair amount of attention and support for her plight. So they had to release her early as a result of that. But the fact that she was imprisoned for being essentially rebellious is, I think, indicative of how the state would be treating Black women, certainly during this period and to some extent today as well.
Now, we've talked a bit about how she used her body in the hunger strike context, but as you mentioned, she was also an athlete. So the very fact of her body and how she used it was also part of how she gained a platform, not a huge platform. Like you said, she wasn't, this outstanding athlete that everybody
Mhm.
would have known the name of, but it was still a platform. So, how did she use the achievements that she did have as an athlete to leverage that in her activism?
For a little bit of context about track and field in this period, track and field as a sport really emerges in the 1920s. And for a while, white women in the 20s were really interested in the sport, and there was a kind of spirit and culture of athleticism. But by the 1930s, increasingly, this was seen as a quote unquote manly sport, right? A sport that made women more masculine, that was unfeminine, unladylike. So women's colleges, white women's colleges, I should say, in the United States suspended their track and field teams, and white women basically fled the sport. So that left an opening for African American women to come in and to dominate the sport, which they did. I mean, the track and field teams in the 50s and 60s and were predominantly African American. The most famous star to come out of this is Wilma Rudolph, which some people may have heard of. Really remarkable. Most of those athletes were out of the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities. There's some very famous track and field teams out of those all Black universities. Those athletes were really encouraged to be as feminine as possible. So, because there's the stereotypes that are associated with Black women, and then there's the stereotypes that are associated with track and field. So they were told to wear lots of makeup, their hair had to be a certain way, certainly straightened hair, etc. So there was a lot of emphasis on that femininity. Rose Robinson and her sisters came up not through the Black colleges, but through in the city of Chicago, and other cities would have similar sort of situations. There was these clubs, basically club teams, amateur club teams that they came up through. And at some point, Rose Robinson had the best high jump record in the country a few different times that she achieved. So she really was doing very, very well in the 1950s, in the Pan American Games and other major track and field events. So in the late 1950s, in 1959, the State Department was engaged in a kind of Cold War politics of using Black athletes as well as entertainers, people like Louis Armstrong, for example, to have them travel to the Soviet Union, but also to newly independent decolonized nations to demonstrate that essentially America was a great place for Black people to live and to thrive in, right? That they were being used as propaganda. So she was approached by the State Department to be part of a team, a traveling team, to go to the Soviet Union to demonstrate, again, this sort of message that the State Department was desperately trying to craft as the civil rights movement was growing stronger and there was a lot of racial conflict and violence in the United States. And she refused to go. And that was really what caught the attention of the FBI and certainly the federal government to go after her. And she refused to go for sort of the reason that you might suspect, which is that she was didn't want to be part of Cold War propaganda. She's a radical pacifist, right? She doesn't want to be part of sending that kind of message. But she also writes this really interesting piece in one of the, pacifist publications where she talks about how the Soviet women athletes are treated so much better. And in the United States, Soviet women were considered to be, again, manly, masculine, not unlike the beautiful, feminine, American women. But she says that Soviet women had good training grounds. They were supported by the state to allow them to train at a very high level. They were given, money in order to survive, so they didn't have to work the kind of menial jobs that she had to work. In contrast to the United States, where women athletes were completely ignored, certainly weren't supported by the state, and really had to struggle to get training and to get to the various events. So I think that that contrast was actually really interesting as well. She also, at the Pan American Games that same year, refused to stand up for the national anthem, which is a form of protest that's often associated more recently with Colin Kaepernick, who was a American football player who refused to stand up for the national anthem. Well, she does it in 1959. So she is again showing her politics in the context of this sort of athletic world. And again, I think that's where a lot of the attention then falls to her, and she ends up in prison the following year because of that kind of activity in this sort of Cold War Red Scare context. The her own physical abilities do also really help her during the hunger strikes. She does have a kind of physical strength. And the other thing that I think is really interesting relates to the another book I wrote, which is about the history of recreation and race. I first ran across her because I was writing about a desegregation campaign in Cleveland about roller skating. So recreational spaces in the United States were segregated not only in the South, but fully, throughout the country. Roller skating rinks was one of those spaces. And so you have these activists, mostly in the Congress of Racial Equality in the late 40s and 50s, who are working to desegregate these spaces. She's very, very good at roller skating. And so what they do is they have these skate-ins, so they could, as opposed to a sit-in. So they often manage to actually get into the roller skating rink. They have like a white friend buys the tickets, then they all go in. And then they go on the rink. And then they're attacked by basically white teenagers, guys in their, maybe young 20s or teens who are trying to beat these people up, get them out of the rink. And she's such a good roller skater that she's able to evade them. And you can kind of imagine her skating around quickly. They do eventually, she does actually get injured in this particular desegregation effort. She actually ends up with her arm broken because they shove her down into the rink. So I was also intrigued there about how her athleticism and her abilities, allow her to participate in the civil rights activity as well, which is another kind of sideline of her activism.
Do you think she would do roller derby given the chance?
Oh, probably. Yeah, she probably would. Although she also her kind of self-presentation to the extent that I can get at that through photographs and through people's memories. She was definitely also engaged in a certain level of respectability politics, so maybe roller derby would be a little bit far, but she used to hitchhike, which I thought was intriguing for the 1950s. and she was not, and she was definitely willing to put her body um, in danger and to use her body in ways that really fit her politics and fit her moral standing or her moral ideas.
Now, this may be my personal bias, but when I think of pacifists, my mind pictures older white ladies. And I'm not sure how much of that is my perception versus a larger framing in different movements where the more respectable or the more palatable people tend to be the ones who get more press coverage, like you were saying about the mother with the pearls.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One sort of stereotype about pacifism comes from what we call the peace churches. So, like the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Hutterites, the traditional peace churches. They were the ones during World War I, for example. Most of the conscientious objectors were from those churches. And it's a kind of form of pacifism that's about literally passive, right? Not engaging in. So, the radical pacifists differ because they're using nonviolent direct action, the tactics taken from the Gandhian movement in a much more aggressive way, in order to fight these sort of evils of militarism, of race, white supremacy, not so much about around gender, although I can talk about that, but those two in particular in the U.S. context. So it's a more assertive, more aggressive, and sometimes they'll actually use militaristic terms to try to emphasize that so they're not seen as just passive. War without violence, things like that, they'll talk about themselves as soldiers. Sometimes it's very masculine language, which is problematic. So this is a more kind of specific form of radical nonviolent direct action that emerges in the late 30s and 40s in the US context, obviously different times in terms of where you're talking about in the world. And the most important and prominent aspect of this is in the civil rights movement, in the long civil rights movement. So, using nonviolent direct action in sit ins and other forms of nonviolent demonstrations, where the activists are nonviolent, but the police who are arresting them, the white thugs who are surrounding them and beating them, or in some cases murdering them, are very, very much not nonviolent. So, it does, create a lot of conflict. So she's much more part of that lineage, and that legacy. Having said that, there is also a very distinctive kind of feminine or feminist peace movement throughout the 20th century. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Women's Strike for Peace, which is much more based and generally speaking on a kind of maternalist politics, where these women are using their positionality as mothers to argue that they are trying to save the world from nuclear warfare, if you're thinking about the post-war world, for their children, right? So the maternalist politics is very, very strong with that kind of women's peace movement. So Rose Robinson and the other female peacemakers are not part of that. It's sort of interesting. They're part of this interracial, cross-gender, radical pacifist movement that is not deploying those maternalist arguments. It's more kind of anarchist, actually, in terms of its political affiliation. They're against the state. They don't want the state to create weapons and to create violence globally. They don't want the state to enact violence in terms of white supremacy on African Americans and others. And they don't want the state to imprison people. So the hunger strike is a resistance to the state, saying you maybe you put me in the cell, but you can't control anything else. You will not control my body. I will not let the state control my body. That is the sort of bottom line. So it has a kind of anarchist stream through it in terms of the thinking, which is interesting as well. So it is separate from the women's peace movement, which is also a fascinating movement, which produces all sorts of interesting activism and writing. But these women are part of this other strand.
Well, something that's come up before in different conversations is how militancy or radical activism looks through a gendered lens. So,
Hmm.
if anyone wants to go listen to the conversations that I had about Pat Robinson or Mary Church Terrell, we get into how what we think of when we think of terms like militant and radical is very much the masculine version is
Yes.
and so how does that look when women are doing these things that we can still consider militant, we can still consider radical. They just aren't as loud and in your face.
Yeah, and there was a fair amount of gender tension within these radical pacifist circles, where the men would, on the more dangerous kind of missions, like sailing a boat into the Pacific Ocean to try to block a nuclear, a hydrogen bomb testing or something like that, where they did those kinds of actions. They generally excluded women from those actions, and the women were not happy about that. There was actually a fair amount of tension around that. And there is a kind of break that happens in the late 60s and early 1970s, where some of these pacifist women, and these are relatively small groups, stumble upon feminism and start going to consciousness raising groups. There's a separate peacemaker like conference of just the women. But other women in the movement are frustrated with this because they see, you know, at the most extreme, the ideology is, and this is partly reflective of some of their religious beliefs, is that race doesn't exist and gender doesn't exist. That humans are equal. That biological race and gender um, should not be considered divisions. Those are just divisions that divide people, and that if you're fully part of this community, again, this is sort of the utopian strand. If you're fully part of this community, then you believe everybody is absolutely equal in every possible way. And so having a separate, say, Black Power organization or a separate feminist organization of just women or people identifying as women would be divisive. So there is some ideological splits within these radical movements around those questions. I think one of the things that's interesting about Rose Robinson is that she isn't a mother. She does not. I have only one piece of evidence of one romantic relationship she had with a man, but that's it. So I find her sort of intriguing. She's kind of finding family in some senses in these communities, and they do live communally. They live in group houses and stuff like that, right? And they eat vegetarian food, they meditate, they do some yoga, and in like the 1950s, which is sort of intriguing as well. So there is a bit of a countercultural aspect to it, but there's not a strongly identified kind of feminist strand in the movement. And when that does happen, it does create, division.
You've written about Robinson before in two other books, Race, Riots, and Roller Coasters, The Struggle Over Segregated Recreation in America, which you mentioned earlier.
The roller skating, yes.
Yep. And Living in the Future, Utopianism and the Long Civil Rights Movement. But what was it about her specifically that made you want to dedicate an entire book to her story?
Yeah. So, in that utopianism book, I mean, I wrote about the Peacemakers, which is the group that she is part of, in that Cold War era. And I think that her life story, but mostly her activism, is really helps us kind of reconsider that time period. So this book is not going to be a birth to death kind of traditional biography. It's going to be more of a what historians sometimes call a micro history, where using the roller skating desegregation campaigns, the State Department refusal, the long hunger strikes and civil rights activity as a way to think about resistance during the Cold War. Um, particularly, always find it interesting, and it's really quite intellectually rigorous, the ways in which Robinson and her friends really link the dangers of atomic warfare and militarism to the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle. They really see these things as interlinked in really fascinating and I think incredibly insightful ways. And there's just more resistance to things like the Korean War, for example, which is often overlooked. Things like the air raid drills during this period of particularly the 1950s that they were resisting. So they'd be resisting the air raid drills one week, and then the next week be doing a sit-in at an amusement park, or maybe trying to support sharecroppers in the South who were staging some sort of protest. So they're kind of going back and forth between these different kind of linked movements in ways that I found really intriguing.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well-behaved women rarely make history.